horror stories that will terrify you. Part 1. The Missing Son, A Neighbor's Secret. It was supposed to be a simple, ordinary suburban life. A quiet neighborhood, neatly manicured lawns, and the occasional friendly chat with your neighbors over a cup of coffee or at the mailbox. But all of that changed the moment Jason Carson knocked on my door, his face pale and haunted. I can still remember the way his hand trembled as he clutched the doorframe, barely able to hold himself together. His wife Claire was not at the door with him, which was odd. Normally, they were always together, inseparable in a way that spoke of years of shared history and perhaps even silent understanding. But that day, Jason stood alone, and in that moment, the weight of his words hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for. "Have you seen Lucas?" he asked, his voice cracking, as though the words themselves were too heavy to speak. My mind raced. Lucas was Jason and Claire's 14-year-old son. He had always been a quiet, thoughtful kid, the kind of boy who kept to himself but wasn't unfriendly, the type of neighbor you barely noticed, but when you did, you nodded and exchanged pleasantries. I couldn't fathom what Jason was saying. "No, Jason," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "I haven't seen him. What's going on?" Jason's eyes filled with unshed tears. "He's gone," he whispered, barely above a breath. "I don't know where he is. We called the police, but it's been hours. It's like he vanished." My heart sank. The dread in his voice felt like a cold knife twisting inside me. I could see his body tense with every word, each syllable a heavy burden. Jason was a man who, until then, had always seemed in control, confident in his demeanor and actions. But standing there on my porch, he was a broken man, desperately searching for something he had already lost. I could tell by the vacant look in his eyes that hope was slipping away. The news of Lucas's disappearance spread like wildfire. It was the talk of the neighborhood, the kind of thing that haunted your thoughts and hung in the air like an unspoken question. Where did he go? Was he taken? Or had something far worse happened? The local news picked up the story, and posters with Lucas's face covered every lamppost, every grocery store window, and every telephone pole. Jason and Claire became living shadows, wandering through their days like ghosts. The sorrow in their eyes was evident, but something else lingered there too. A quiet, gnawing fear that perhaps, after all, they knew more than they were letting on. But I never asked. As the weeks dragged on without word from Lucas, we all began to assume the worst. The search parties fizzled out. The police investigation grew colder, and with every passing day, the absence of Lucas became just another part of the Carsons' life. Yet Jason and Claire never spoke about it openly. They didn't mention Lucas's name anymore, as if saying it aloud would make the pain too real. And as much as Karen and I wanted to comfort them, we felt as if there was an invisible barrier between us now. A distance that no amount of kindness could bridge. The subtle shifts, something unseen. It wasn't long before the changes in Jason and Claire became impossible to ignore. The outward signs were subtle, but they were there, hidden beneath the surface. At first, we noticed that Claire, once warm and engaging, had become a mere shell of her former self. The woman who used to greet us with a friendly smile and ask about our lives now avoided conversation, her responses short and distant. At family gatherings, she barely spoke, sitting in the corner with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes staring off into nothing. There were days when I swore she didn't even blink. Jason, on the other hand, became increasingly uneasy, as though every interaction required more effort than he had in him. He no longer made eye contact, his words often trailing off into awkward silences. He would twitch at the slightest noise, always checking his surroundings, his eyes scanning the crowd, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. But the most unsettling change was his unspoken, almost desperate need to keep busy. Jason became obsessed with home improvement projects. It was as though he could no longer sit still, as though any moment of stillness might allow his grief to consume him. They still invited Karen and me over for the occasional barbecue, but the atmosphere had changed. There was an undeniable tension in the air, a feeling that something was being kept hidden just out of sight. Claire would offer a half-hearted smile, but it was as if the light had left her eyes. Jason would try to engage in casual conversation, but it always fell flat, his nervous laughter filling the spaces where words should have been. It was around this time that Jason asked to borrow a shovel. The shovel incident, the first real sign. It happened one warm afternoon as I was outside taking out the trash. Jason appeared at the gate, looking flustered and out of breath, his hands shaking as he approached me. "Hey," he said, his voice strained. "I need to borrow a shovel. I've got some work to do in the backyard." I didn't think much of it at first. I had known Jason for years, and he was always asking to borrow tools for one project or another. But something in the way he asked unsettled me. There was an urgency in his voice, a desperation that I couldn't quite place. Without hesitating, I went inside to grab my best shovel and handed it to him. "I'll expect it back by tomorrow," I said lightly, but Jason just nodded quickly and disappeared into his yard. Later that evening, I was upstairs in my office, looking out of the window that overlooked Jason's backyard, when I saw him. He was digging, and not just digging a small hole. It was huge. The dirt piled up beside him, and his shovel seemed to strike the ground with an unrelenting force. At first, I thought it was just some late-night landscaping project, but the more I watched, the more I became convinced that this wasn't a typical home improvement project. Jason struggled to move the dirt, and as he paused to catch his breath, I noticed him glance nervously around, checking the surrounding houses, as if he were afraid someone might be watching. That was when I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something strange, something wrong about the whole situation. But I told myself I was overthinking it. People grieve in different ways, right? Maybe Jason was just dealing with things in his own way. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining things. The midnight revelation, the moment of no return. That night, as the clock struck 1:30 a.m., I couldn't sleep. The image of Jason digging in his yard, the intensity in his eyes, the secrecy in his movements. Those thoughts kept circling in my head like a haunting refrain. I had to know what he was doing. I slipped out of bed and, as quietly as I could, made my way downstairs. My heart was pounding, and a sense of dread settled over me like a thick fog. I grabbed my flashlight and tiptoed out the back door, heading straight for the fence that separated our properties. The cold night air stung my skin, but I barely noticed it. My focus was entirely on the backyard ahead of me. There, in the dim light of the moon, I saw Jason still digging, but now there was something different, something darker. He had made the hole even larger, and it looked as though he had dug far deeper than before. My eyes strained in the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A small black garbage bag, sticking out from the dirt at the bottom of the hole. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. This wasn't just a garden project. My mind raced. Could it be? Could Jason have buried his son in that hole? The thought seemed absurd, but it gnawed at me with such intensity that I couldn't look away. I stood frozen, torn between the urge to run and the curiosity that kept me rooted to the spot. The decision wasn't easy, but I couldn't bring myself to investigate further. As if on cue, Jason stopped digging and looked up, scanning the yard as though he had sensed something. His eyes locked onto mine in the darkness, and for a moment I felt exposed, like he could see through me, reading my every thought. I quickly turned and retreated back to my house, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The consequences. What do you do with the truth? The next morning, when I looked out the window, I saw that the hole had been filled in. Jason's SUV, which had been parked in the driveway the night before, was now on the street. He avoided eye contact as he passed by my house, and a wave of unease washed over me. I wanted to confront him, to ask him what he was doing, but I couldn't. What if I was wrong? What if I was just imagining things? I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had changed, that I had witnessed something I wasn't meant to see. But what could I do with the information I had? I couldn't prove anything, and if I did confront Jason, how would he react? What if he was hiding something far worse than I could ever imagine? So I stayed quiet, but the terror lingered, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. And as the days passed, I couldn't shake the thought that Jason Carson had buried more than just the truth. Part 2. The Troubled Boys Next Door. A Dangerous Encounter. The peace and quiet of our new home didn't last long. The neighborhood, once a quiet and seemingly safe haven, slowly became a place of dread as strange encounters and ominous events began to unfold. It all started when the two boys next door, Ethan and Daniel, began to show an interest in me and my younger brother Brian. At first they seemed harmless, just two local boys with a penchant for keeping to themselves. Their family was quiet, and like many others in the neighborhood, they kept mostly to their own space. I had seen them from time to time standing by the fence or walking down the street in silence, their heads always down. But something about their demeanor never quite sat right with me. Their aloofness, the way they seemed to drift through life without ever truly connecting with anyone, it was unsettling, like they were outsiders in their own world. But I never gave them much thought. After all, we all had our quirks. That all changed the day Daniel approached me while I was outside, shooting basketball with Brian on the driveway. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over everything. But Daniel's presence was anything but ordinary. He appeared out of nowhere, walking toward me with his usual expressionless face. He asked a simple question that caught me off guard. "Is it true you're moving?" Brian and I exchanged a quick glance. How did he know that? My parents hadn't shared the news yet, and our moving date wasn't even set. "Yeah," I said, shrugging it off. "We're moving in a few months." His eyes didn't leave mine as he processed the information. Then, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, he spoke again, this time inviting us to join him and Ethan the following day for a trip to the river. "We're going to shoot BB guns. You should come with us. It'll be fun," he said flatly. There was something in the way he said it, an odd edge to his voice, but I pushed it out of my mind. We were just kids. What harm could there be in going to the river to shoot some BB guns? Besides, I was bored, and Brian was excited at the thought of doing something adventurous. The next day, we walked down the street together to meet them. Daniel and Ethan were already there, waiting by the edge of the woods. Both of them were dressed in full camouflage, carrying large duffel bags slung over their shoulders. It struck me as strange, but I figured it was just their way of getting into the spirit of things. What could go wrong? When I saw them pull out the guns, something inside me tightened. They weren't BB guns. They were real, loaded firearms. I froze, staring at the rifles they so casually handed me and Brian, my heart hammering in my chest. I had seen guns before, on TV, at the shooting range, but this was different. These were real weapons. The cold metal felt wrong in my hands, and I realized then that I had made a huge mistake by agreeing to this. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. These aren't BB guns. These are real guns.
Ethan grinned, his smile cold and unnerving. Yeah, we don't mess around with toys. These are the real deal, he said, his voice dripping with something darker than mere amusement. Don't worry, they're perfectly safe. But as the words left his lips, a sense of dread washed over me. This wasn't a friendly afternoon of shooting targets. This was something else entirely. These boys were playing with fire and they were dragging me and Brian into it. I tried to hand the gun back, telling them I wasn't comfortable with it, but Ethan grabbed it out of my hands before I could say more. "You're not backing out now," he said, his voice low and threatening. "We don't take kindly to people who back out." I glanced at Brian, who was still staring at the guns with wide eyes, unsure of what to do. I could tell he was just as scared as I was, but he didn't want to back down either. We were trapped by these boys who seemed to take pleasure in scaring us. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't just about guns, it was about control. They weren't just trying to force us into doing something we didn't want to do. They were trying to break us, to make us afraid of them. And that's when things started to spiral out of control. The first threat. We tried to leave. I grabbed Brian's hand, pulling him away from the group, but Ethan blocked our path, his cold eyes narrowing. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice laced with a dangerous edge. "You think you can just walk away?" I tried to push past him, but he shoved me back hard. "You don't get to leave until we say so," he sneered. It was then that Daniel spoke up, his voice softer, but no less menacing. "You better not tell anyone about this, or we'll make sure you regret it." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of something unspoken, something dark. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. I tried to keep my composure, but the fear that had settled in my chest was overwhelming. I didn't know what these boys were capable of, but I knew they weren't playing games. This wasn't some innocent childhood mischief. This was something far more sinister. The night of the threats. That night, as I lay in bed, the image of Ethan and Daniel haunted me. The way they smiled at us, the way they spoke to us. It all felt wrong. But it wasn't just the guns or the threats that disturbed me. It was the look in their eyes. They enjoyed the power they held over us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. I woke up around 3:00 a.m. to the sound of something outside my window. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to shake off the remnants of sleep. I crept to the window, peering through the blinds. There, standing in the darkness, was Daniel, his face partially obscured by the shadows, his eyes gleaming with a cold, predatory look. I could feel my blood run cold as I stared at him, unable to move. He knew I was awake. He knew I was watching. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Daniel vanished into the night, leaving behind only a lingering sense of unease. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had just narrowly escaped something much worse. The night had been a warning. But from who? And why? The final confrontation. The next day, the tension reached its peak. Ethan and Daniel appeared at my door, their eyes empty of any pretense. They didn't knock. They just stood there, waiting. I could feel the weight of their presence like a physical thing, pressing in on me. "You think you're safe?" Ethan asked, his voice cold and taunting. "You think you can just forget about us?" I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I had no answers for them, no way to escape their grasp. Before I could make sense of the situation, Daniel stepped forward, his face twisted with something resembling amusement. "You should have stayed out of it. Now it's too late." I could feel the anger and fear rising inside me. These weren't just boys. They were something else entirely. They were predators, and we were their prey. Without warning, they grabbed Brian and me, dragging us into the woods behind our house. We struggled, but it was no use. They were stronger than us, their grip tight and unforgiving. Just as I thought we might be completely trapped, something unexpected happened. A car pulled up along the road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I recognized it instantly. Our neighbor,
Mr. Thompson, who had always been friendly but distant, was driving by. He saw us struggling, and without hesitation, he slammed on the brakes and rushed toward us. "Hey!" Mr. Thompson shouted. "What's going on here?" The boys hesitated, momentarily stunned by his sudden arrival. That was enough. In the confusion, I yanked free from Daniel's grip and grabbed Brian's hand. We ran. Mr. Thompson didn't let up, demanding that they let us go. Finally, the boys backed off, but the message was clear. This was far from over. As I ran back to my house, heart racing and blood pounding in my ears, I realized the true extent of what we had been dealing with. Ethan and Daniel weren't just neighborhood kids. They were a force of terror. And as I slammed the door behind me and locked it, I knew that the nightmare was just beginning. The final realization. The next few days passed in a blur. The terror of that night didn't fade. It only grew stronger. It wasn't just about Ethan and Daniel anymore. It was about the fear they had planted deep inside me. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what they were capable of. And most of all, fear that, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the shadows they cast over our lives. The boys continued to watch us, to follow us from a distance. They were everywhere, always lurking, always waiting for the right moment to strike. And I knew deep down that there was nothing we could do to stop them. As I lay awake at night, unable to sleep, I realized the truth. Sometimes, the monsters we fear the most aren't the ones we see in the dark. They're the ones who live next door, smiling innocently, waiting for the moment when we least expect it. And that was the scariest truth of all. Part 3. The Deranged Neighbor, a Living Nightmare. Moving into a new house was supposed to be a fresh start. After everything that had happened with the Carsons and the boys next door, I thought that the worst was behind me. I had hoped that my new home would provide the peace I desperately needed, away from the shadows of the past that still haunted me. But in truth, the real nightmare was just beginning. I found my new house in a quiet, somewhat run-down part of town. It wasn't ideal, but it was affordable, perfect for a young person trying to make their way in the world. The neighborhood had its charm, though it wasn't the pristine suburban dream that most people would expect. People here lived quietly, some reclusive, others friendly, but all with their own secrets lurking behind closed doors. Among them, however, there were two individuals who stood out: Martha and her niece Lily. Martha was a woman in her 60s, pale and thin, with an unsettling stillness to her. I never saw her speak much to anyone, but she often stood by the window, watching the world pass by, her gaze fixed and intense. Lily, her niece, was even more disturbing. I had never seen a person quite like her. She had severe mental disabilities, and her outbursts, which seemed to occur at random, were loud and terrifying. Sometimes, when I was outside on my porch, I would catch glimpses of them in their yard. Martha would be trying to calm Lily, but the younger woman's behavior was erratic, rocking back and forth, screaming, her eyes wide and unseeing. It was as if something was inside her, clawing to get out. I thought maybe they just had a troubled life, but there was something about them that felt wrong, something that set my nerves on edge whenever I saw them. The first time I truly began to notice how disturbing their presence was came one summer evening. I was sitting outside, enjoying the evening air, when I heard the faint sound of screaming coming from the direction of their house. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just another one of Lily's episodes, but this scream was different. It wasn't the high-pitched, frantic yelling I had heard before. It was something deeper, more primal, more violent. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I stood up, looking over the fence that separated our houses. Through the thin crack between the boards, I could see Martha holding Lily by the shoulders, trying to keep her calm. But Lily's body was trembling, her hands clawing at her own skin
as she rocked violently back and forth. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, her eyes wide, focused on something unseen. It was the most unsettling thing I had ever witnessed, and I felt my stomach churn with a sense of dread. There was something deeply wrong with Lily, something that went beyond the usual mental instability. It was as if she was possessed by some dark force, something that made her actions unpredictable and dangerous. Martha noticed me watching and immediately stepped back, pulling Lily inside the house. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving me standing there, staring at the empty yard. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed something I wasn't meant to see. But I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just a mother trying to cope with her daughter's condition. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Lily's wild eyes and the terrifying scream lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of an invisible presence pressing down on me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, and I knew deep down that something was terribly wrong next door. As the days went by, I tried to avoid making eye contact with Martha or Lily. I would see them occasionally in their yard, but I kept my distance. The atmosphere around their house felt oppressive, like a storm was always brewing just beyond the horizon, waiting to break. But it wasn't until one fateful evening that the true extent of the nightmare I had unknowingly moved into would become clear. I had just finished dinner and was preparing to settle in for the night when I heard a faint knock on my door. At first, I thought it was just someone trying to sell me something or ask about neighborhood events. But when I opened the door, it wasn't a stranger standing there. It was Lily. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her expression empty, as if she wasn't really there at all. Her body was shaking, and she held something tightly in her hands, though I couldn't see what it was. I froze, unsure of what to do. I had never interacted with her directly before, and her sudden appearance on my doorstep filled me with unease. "Can you help me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, I need to be safe." I stepped back, instinctively trying to create some distance between us. There was something in her tone that sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Lily, what do you mean? What's going on?" Her eyes seemed to lock onto mine with an intensity I couldn't describe. "It's not safe. You can't stay here," she said, her voice shaking. "They'll come for you too." I felt my heart skip a beat. Who was she talking about? Who would come for me? Before I could respond, she suddenly turned and bolted, disappearing into the darkness of the street. I stood there in stunned silence, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Who was she talking about? And why was she so terrified? The following days brought more tension. Lily's erratic behavior continued, but now there was something different about it. The screams had become more frequent, more desperate, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it. It wasn't just her mental illness. There was something else lurking beneath the surface, something that I was too afraid to face. One night, as I sat in my living room, I heard a soft knock on my window. My pulse quickened, and I slowly walked toward it, peering out into the darkness. And there, standing outside in the yard, was Lily. But she wasn't looking at me. She was staring into my window, her eyes wide and filled with a terrifying emptiness. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I had never felt so exposed in my life. I didn't know if she was just watching me because of some mental condition, or if there was something more sinister at play. But in that moment, I knew that I had to get out of there. I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next encounter would occur. But before I could even move, I heard a voice, Martha's voice, calling from the darkness. "Lily!" she shouted, her voice sharp with panic. "Come back inside!" Lily turned slowly.
almost mechanically, and began to walk toward her house without a word. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed something truly horrifying, something that wasn't just a result of Lily's mental illness. It felt like there was something more, something malevolent, controlling her actions.
That night, I couldn't sleep at all. My thoughts kept returning to Lily's blank stare, to her cryptic warning. "It's not safe. You can't stay here." What did she mean? Was she trying to warn me about something? Was I in danger? The next day, I decided to confront Martha. I had to know what was going on next door. I needed answers.
When I knocked on her door, Martha opened it slowly, her face as cold and distant as always. She didn't seem surprised to see me standing there.
"Can I help you?" she asked, her voice low and controlled. I hesitated, unsure of how to phrase it. "I don't know what's going on with Lily. She came to my door last night and—" Martha's eyes narrowed. "She's not well," she interrupted, her tone suddenly sharp. "You need to stay away from her. You don't know what she's capable of." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean? What is she capable of?" Martha stepped back, pulling the door slightly closed, as if to shield me from something. "It's better if you don't know. Just stay away, for your own good." Before I could ask any more questions, she slammed the door shut. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. The fear in her eyes was undeniable. Whatever was happening next door, it wasn't just a mother dealing with her troubled daughter. It was something far darker, far more dangerous. I knew then that I had made a grave mistake by moving here. But what could I do? Leave? But where would I go? The sense of being trapped, of being drawn into something far beyond my control, began to suffocate me, and as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the true nightmare had only just begun. As I look back on everything that has happened, the unsettling encounters with the Carsons, the terrifying ordeal with Ethan and Daniel, and the horrifying experiences with Lily and Martha, I can't help but feel a profound sense of unease that will never quite leave me. What started as a typical neighborhood experience spiraled into a nightmare, revealing how the seemingly ordinary can quickly turn into something much darker. There are layers to this story, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered, and in the process, it left me with more questions than answers. Throughout the course of these events, I encountered fear, suspicion, and betrayal at levels I never imagined. It wasn't just about strange behaviors or eerie encounters. It was about the unsettling realization that people we think we know, our neighbors, those we interact with daily, can be hiding something much darker beneath their facades. It taught me that sometimes our assumptions about what's normal or safe can blind us to the reality around us. It also reminded me how crucial it is to trust our instincts, that gut feeling, whether it's about something as simple as an awkward interaction or as serious as witnessing something offbeat and unexplained, can be the difference between danger and safety. The Carsons, with their cryptic behavior and Jason's strange request to borrow a shovel, were the first signs that something was wrong. Their son's disappearance hung over them like a dark cloud, and despite the police's investigation, their behavior only grew more suspicious over time. I knew they were hiding something, but I couldn't bring myself to ask outright. Instead, I watched from a distance, letting the unease grow until it consumed my thoughts. I saw Jason's desperation in the way he hurried to fill that hole, and the paranoia in his eyes when he realized I was watching. His obsession with keeping something buried, both literally and figuratively, left me questioning everything. But the terror didn't end with the Carsons. It moved to a whole new level when Ethan and Daniel entered the picture. What had seemed like a simple invitation to spend time together quickly turned into a nightmare of threats and harassment. I should have recognized the signs earlier, their cold demeanor, the way they carried themselves with a sense of superiority. and how quickly they became hostile when their actions were questioned.
The guns they pulled out weren't just symbols of power. They were weapons of intimidation. And in that moment, I understood that these boys weren't the innocent kids I had assumed they were. The fear I felt was palpable, the realization that in this world there are people who feel no remorse, no empathy, and no hesitation when it comes to controlling others through fear.
But it was with Lily and Martha, my most terrifying neighbors, that the horrors truly became personal. Living next to them was like living in constant fear. At first, I thought it was just a strange situation, but the longer I stayed in the house, the more I realized that this wasn't just about odd behavior. It was about something far deeper and darker.
Lily's outbursts, Martha's controlling nature, and the terrifying encounter in the middle of the night. Those things left me feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. The look in Lily's eyes when she stared at me, the way she seemed to always be watching me, became a reminder that some people or something can't be reasoned with. No amount of politeness, no exchange of pleasantries would change the fact that they were dangerous. The constant feeling of being watched, the terrifying moments where I couldn't tell whether I was safe or if I was being hunted, was a psychological toll that I'll never forget. The incident where Lily appeared at my bedside, her face just inches away from mine in the dead of night, was something out of a nightmare. It was an image that haunted me for weeks, and I couldn't shake the idea that I was trapped in a world where safety was an illusion, and I had no control over what happened next.
The conclusion to this story wasn't about any grand reveal or final confrontation. It was simply the realization that sometimes the horror is not in the monsters you see, but in the ones you don't. The fear of the unknown is a powerful thing, and once it's rooted in your mind, it's almost impossible to escape. In the end, I left the house, but the fear I felt, the questions that lingered about what I saw and what I didn't, followed me.
I left behind the haunted neighborhood, but part of the terror never left. Even now, as I try to move on, I still feel the shadows of those experiences lurking at the back of my mind. So, what can we take away from this story? What are the lessons that we, as individuals, can apply in our own lives to prevent these kinds of horrors from unfolding, or at least help us recognize them when they're happening around us? The first lesson is the importance of trusting your instincts. In every encounter with the Carsons, Ethan and Daniel, and Lily and Martha, there were moments when my gut told me something wasn't right. I felt the fear, the tension, the discomfort, but at times I ignored it, convincing myself it was nothing. We all have that inner voice, that intuition, warning us when something feels off, and it's crucial that we listen to it.
Too often, we brush off our discomfort, thinking we're overreacting or being paranoid. But the truth is, our instincts are a powerful tool for self-preservation. If something doesn't feel right, don't dismiss it. Pay attention. It might be the difference between staying safe or walking into a dangerous situation. Another lesson is about the danger of assuming others are like us. In each case, I assumed that the Carsons, Ethan and Daniel, and Lily and Martha were all just quirky neighbors, that their oddities were merely part of their personalities. I never thought they could be hiding dark secrets, let alone putting my life at risk. People are capable of things that we can't always understand, and we should never take anyone at face value. Just because someone seems like they belong in the same world as us doesn't mean they do. Always approach others with an open mind, but also with caution. Moreover, the idea that we should never ignore the signs is crucial. I had a front row seat to the eerie behavior of my neighbors, yet I still tried to rationalize it, thinking they were just eccentric or troubled. But often,
Those little things that we dismiss as odd or uncomfortable can be symptoms of something far darker. Whether it's a shift in someone's behavior, small lies, or subtle clues, it's important to notice these things and ask the hard questions.
When we ignore the signs, we risk allowing something terrible to happen.
Lastly, this story is a reminder to protect yourself, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. The psychological toll of living in fear is real, and it can damage your peace of mind in ways you don't expect. Sometimes, the best course of action is to remove yourself from harmful situations, no matter how difficult or inconvenient it may be. Don't allow fear and anxiety to hold you captive. Protect your mental health by recognizing when it's time to walk away, even if that means leaving behind something that once seemed safe.
If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for taking the time to read through this entire journey. Stories like these aren't just about entertainment. They're about reflection and learning. The experiences shared here serve as reminders to all of us to remain vigilant, trust our instincts, and always prioritize our safety and well-being. If you found this story compelling, thought-provoking, or just plain chilling, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel for more content like this. Your support is what drives us to create even more terrifying, thought-provoking stories that explore the depths of human nature, fear, and the unknown. By subscribing, you're helping ensure that we can continue to bring you more spine-chilling stories and keep you on the edge of your seat.
We've only scratched the surface of what's out there. There's so much more to uncover, so many more tales to tell, and I want you to be part of this journey. Don't miss out on our future videos. Hit that subscribe button and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what you think about this story and share your own eerie experiences. I'd love to hear from you.
Remember, stay safe, stay alert, and never underestimate the power of your own intuition. Until next time, keep watching, keep listening, and stay vigilant. The next terrifying story is just around the corner. Subscribe now and let the mystery continue.